Hello, welcome to the Autistic Witch. My name is Claire and I'm your host today. One of the things I wanted to talk about was the topic of non-binariness and also how I felt as a non-binary autistic person in contemporary society in the UK. Particularly regarding some of the language used. But before I get into all that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the history first, because sometimes I think it's important to get the context right for this. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about first was this distinction between paganism and witchcraft. I often use the terms interchangeably, but I recognise there is a distinction between these two terms, particularly because you can be a pagan without being a witch, and equally you can be a witch without being a pagan. It's just that for me, I see them as very intertwined, but that's because of how I practice. So I wanted to begin by making this distinction and to talk a little bit about the history of how paganism has evolved and why I feel some of the language and some of the things that people might believe in and evolved in the way that they have. So first of all, what's the difference between paganism and witchcraft? Well, paganism is a spiritual belief. Some call it a religion. Some distinguish it as just a, as I say, a spiritual practice. But it can be standalone as well on its own. And there are many different forms. I'm sure you can explore that in other, easily Google that. So there are, druids, there are solitary witches, there are people who choose their own path as well, and are not necessarily defined by one path or another. Anyway, for me, paganism is my spiritual belief system. However, witchcraft is a practice. This is, for me, practical, everyday stuff that you may do in your own community. And so this is how I see it. I have my spiritual belief, which fits within paganism, and respecting the earth, understanding nature, understanding the seasons, connecting to the cycles of the moon, that sort of thing. That's where it fits for me. And then I have my witchcraft, which is the practical, everyday stuff that I do, which is the everyday magic, really. And that's the stuff around, I suppose, how I interact with my spiritual beliefs. So this is things like, and I will do another video about foraging, for example. So foraging is one example, respecting nature. Practical everyday stuff that I might do, how I use herbs in cooking. I'm very attracted to the kitchen witchcraft, hedge witchery. That's very much where I'm orientated. Anyway, so that's the distinction between paganism and witchcraft. But for me, I see the one as a spiritual belief and the other as my everyday practice, and they're very much entwined into one another. So what I wanted to do as well is to talk a little bit about how that's kind of evolved, because it really has evolved over I suppose really the last 100 years, and it's really been sort of a modern reinterpretation, or relatively modern reinterpretation, of a very ancient belief system. And one of the problems that we've had is, unfortunately, we killed most of our witches and people who had that knowledge, or they were too afraid to share that knowledge. So we've had this big gap. Now, when the Witchcraft Act was repealed in 1951, this is in the UK context, it gave the opportunity for people to explore it in a more open way. So we had people like Gerald Gardner, for example, who is considered the father of witchcraft. But he was also, I suppose you could say, he was a man of his time, and his beliefs and ideas about paganism and witchcraft, which in this context I'm using interchangeably, he had quite misogynistic views. And he was somebody who was very patriarchal, very traditional, and as I say, was a man of that time. So a lot of the, I suppose, things that he set up, ideas that he had, were centred around very traditional based stuff. So you'd got masculine, feminine, divine. You'd got the woman who was the maiden, mother, crone idea. So this takes me into exploring how I feel about this as a contemporary person that's neurodiverse. So I have, for me, as a non-binary person, and also whose sexuality is quite fluid as well, I find some of this stuff quite uncomfortable. It doesn't sit well with me. So I wanted to open up a discussion about it, a conversation really. And this isn't a judgment. So, and I have some really good friends who are traditional witches, who are really comfortable with the term. A crone, for example, I have a good friend who's really comfortable with that. Loves to use the masculine and feminine divine, and that's okay. I'm not saying don't do that. What I'm saying is this is something that hasn't sat well with me, because I've evolved, I suppose, in terms of how I define myself as a person. And in contemporary society, I have begun to just challenge that view a little bit, and to challenge how I see my own practice. So when I began this journey, I began honouring the masculine and feminine divine, because that is what I was taught to do. And then as I began to question things a little bit more, I began to think, well, actually, if I define myself as non-binary, how do I feel about this? How do I feel about, this kind of really quite straight model, and not really a very inclusive one, not inclusive of trans people, intersex, LGBT. I started to think about all this stuff, started to think, well, hang on a minute, how do I feel about this? It's quite a straight model. So I began to think, okay, maybe for me, I want to just rip up that rule book and rethink this. So, and I also began thinking about how I saw the divine effectively, and how I saw my spiritual practice. What I very quickly realised is, nature isn't binary. energy isn't binary. Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about energy here, an energetic divine force that is our everyday magic, that is all around us. And just look at plants. We don't say that's a male tree or that's a female tree. Their flowering parts have both masculine and feminine parts. And I think nature is more complex. You only have to look at snails, for example, who have both male and female parts too. So I think that it just sort of struck me that I wanted to find a different practice. I wanted to find a different way forward. And I also found it distasteful to talk about divine feminine and female energy in terms of maiden mother crone. Again, it felt for me very misogynistic, very patriarchal, and really quite judgmental. In terms of paganism, we don't speak about men in the same way. So, I have never heard anyone refer to a man as the boy, the father, and an old man, for example, in the same way that we do with women. So, again, I'm not criticising you if you feel that way. As I say, I have a friend who's really comfortable with that. But for me, it wasn't sitting right. It didn't feel right. And I felt it was important to just take those labels and to reframe that and to have that conversation and to say, you know what, if I'm going to honour the feminine divine, both within me and within nature, I don't really want to be using those terms. I want to be seeing this in a different way. If I'm going to honour the masculine equally, I don't want to be seeing it in these terms. I want to honour it in a different way. And that's really where I began to unpick things and where I began to feel much more comfortable just having this belief where I honoured divine energy as a non-binary force that was a divine magic that was around us every day. So that's really where my thoughts led me and where I began to unpick some of this. And as I say, these are very much my personal journey, my thoughts and beliefs. And I am not saying that, this is the right way and that other ways are wrong. Not at all. I think for when you embark on this journey, this is a very personal, spiritual journey. And I feel for me, it's been really important to find my own path, find what feels right for me, and to define how I feel about that, and to really challenge some of the, I suppose you could say, accepted beliefs, ideas. When people set this up, people such as Gerald Gardner, he was, I suppose you could say, brave at that time when he was publishing and writing his books. The information wasn't out there. So, he did what he could with his, the knowledge that he had at that time. But the world has changed. The world has evolved, and people have evolved in terms of their own definitions. And I just feel today in contemporary paganism, for me, it was important to just rethink that and have that conversation around, well, how do I feel about using these terms, maiden, mother, crone? What if I've not been able to have children? What if I don't define myself that way? What if I'm not comfortable with it? There are all sorts of other things as well to consider. So you may have, for example, sadly, you might have had cancer. You might have had to have a radical hysterectomy. And if you're a young woman, technically a maiden, and you've been forced into menopause, where do you fit in all of that? It didn't, there are certain things that didn't quite feel right, and I think it has to be a very personal thing. You have to define how you feel about it, and as I say, I just wanted to share that journey, my thoughts and feelings about it, and to say, you know, though I respect others and how they may practice, I've been on my own sort of redefining the practice, my pagan belief, and how I want to move forward. And it's an evolving picture, because I'm evolving as a person too, and that may also shift over time as well. So anyway, thank you for watching my Autistic Witch. Please like and subscribe, or give me any comments. You know, I'm happy to receive any feedback, and I hope to be with you again soon. Thank you.